Hello, my name is Dr. Jacqueline Radishek, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group. And my podcast is Hot Topic, Bold Talk. So that's what I make an effort to do is I make an effort to really provide a lot of information about my topic and then also provide both sides of the topic and what's going on with both sides. And then how do we come to a place where we have a better understanding of what is really going on? So I started getting concerned about how critical race theory was being misused in America and how it started with Trump hearing something on Fox News, which I'll give a lot more information about, and then utilizing it in all the messaging he did. So my podcast 49 is already in audio, but I thought about going into video and providing it because I think there's more understanding that I can provide. The title of podcast 49 is to Do You Understand Critical Race Theory? How is it being distorted and where does this distortion begin? Now, I know that critical race theory does not distinguish between individual acts of racism. What critical race theory really does is it says we have an ingrained racism in U.S. systems and institutions. So they're not attacking people. They're literally saying it has been racism has been ingrained in U.S. systems and institutions. So the more I studied critical race theory, the more I realized that there were a lot of questions I had. What is critical race theory? Who started it, and what exactly is it? How does critical race theory explain the impact of systemic racism in America? Have people looked at the white privilege and the white supremacy and the white immunity and the white advantages that exist in our country that other races don't have? Who hasn't considered the extensive research on all these topics, which I think are primarily mega Republicans and Trump himself, because he's using it to he's using the distortion of critical race theory to gain support from white Americans that are fearful of losing something. Well, what I know is that as I went through this, I started also saying, how would critical race theory show up in a classroom? Because now they're banning things in classrooms. Mega Republicans are. What are their criticisms and how are they misusing it? And because they have systematically used it to be very successful at that programming people about what it isn't, but they're still creating a lot of strife in America. And then I said, how do mega Republicans misuse it? What are they doing to they think they're going to fight against woke organizations and woke people. Well, what are their goals in it? And I think we're seeing it more and more. And so I think I have some answers there and can show what it really is. How have the legal institutions, such as law schools and professionals in the legal field, who were the ones that really understand critical race theory better than anyone, seen the now they're looking at the bills that are being passed, and some are not being even supported by the Supreme Courts of the various states. So, what will the legal ramifications be for these states that are passing these bills that are also being now reviewed on the federal level? I do want you to know this is not an exclusive list of questions. I think critical race theory is something that all of us need to understand and know what is the substance of the theory that was written and how it's expounded by the original authors and how it's being misused for political gain. Now, please know that I've read many surveys and studies about critical race theory from both sides of the discussion and found some fascinating realities about what has happened. I hope you will be patient with me and continue to listen to this series of podcasts because sometimes I'll talk about critical race theory, but I'll talk about other things so they can give the emphasis of what is being missed in the dialogues that are occurring, or really the debates and arguments about critical race theory. So, if I fully understand critical race theory, and are able to answer all the questions above that I've asked myself, I will be prepared to acknowledge the criticism of the theory from someone and provide information that a person may not know or did not consider in formulating their opposition against critical race theory. I will also learn something when I talk with individuals that have a different point of view. I know there are Americans in both parties that support and believe in our democratic process. And it is time for us to stop listening to the political interpretations of critical race theory and fully understand how they got to be where they are today. So, what is critical race theory? Now, I have many resources. Well, one of the things that I've learned to do is I often receive excellent resources and lists of resources from Chat GPT. Now, I know many people question the use of it. However, there are responsible ways to do it. When I get resources, then I look for other resources and I compare those resources I get from Chat GPT and those that I find myself. And I read through all the articles and then determine which are the very best. But I can tell you, they gave me some excellent articles that the opposition has written, as well as those that support critical race theory. But here's what I would summarize it if I took all the articles I read in a very simple way to say what critical race theory is. Critical race theory, CRT, is a framework for that emerged in the 1970s as a response to the traditional civil rights approaches. It asserts that racism is not just an individual act, but ingrained in systems and institutions. And CRT highlights how laws and policies maintain racial disparities, even unintentionally, and focuses on the intersections of race, class, and gender. Now, in America, CRT explains that racism is systemic, pervasive, and affects people of color daily, which I think we can see continually. It emphasizes that racism isn't just over acts of discrimination, but is present in social structures. This understanding helps analyze racial disparities in areas like criminal justice and education. In a child's classroom, CRT could manifest by exploring how history, literature, and teaching methods either perpetuate or challenge racial stereotypes. It encourages an honest examination of historical context and their impact. Critics argue that CRT essentializes race, labels all white individuals as privileged oppressors, and stifles free speech. However, proponents counter that CRT promotes critical analysis without assuming guilt. And I think that's one of the things that is very disturbing to me with the actions of Republicans that are banning critical race theory. They don't understand it. And number two, they don't realize that they're limiting students in our various public institutions as well as private educational programs from having a real opportunity to develop critical analysis. Some mega Republicans misuse CRT as a catch all word to criticize any discussion about racism and privilege. That's what we're seeing in Florida and Texas, and I live in Texas. They frame it as an attempt to push a specific agenda and undermine diversity efforts. Now, here's the list of things I bring to the discussion since I have a PhD in counseling psychology and have been in business 47 years. When I research a subject, I read lots of different resources, and I take the time to learn what is CRT and how are things, what related issues need to be addressed with CRT. I consider what I've learned in the 50 years I've been doing diversity work, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. I've gone back to my experiences and learnings from the civil rights movement because I was in college at the time of the civil rights movement. I will utilize my years as a consultant over 60 industries and thousands of organizations I've worked in. I'll also consider both sides of the discussion since I've taught in public school and higher education, and you always have to do that. I know that I will do my best to present information that formulates a picture of what has led us to this debate of CRT, the misuse of CRT, the political actions to attempt to control discussions of racism and privilege. And I want to determine how these podcasts can lead us to a better understanding of CRT, what we can do to open a respectful and meaningful dialogue about CRT, and the impact of new legislation that changes what we can teach in the schools in some states. Emotions that drive this legislation and legal ramifications for all involved in attempting to control what has been discussed in our schools for many, many years. Now, Andrew Cohen wrote an excellent article, The Push to Cancel Critical Race Theory. Scholars explain factors driving the backlash. And that's really what's happening is the backlash. I've chosen this article to begin with since it gives a clear description of CRT and also summarizes the issues involved in the debate about CRT. Podcasts that follow will build greater understanding of both sides of the discussion, and this article helps us clarify the issues involved. So I'm going to read a lot of the article's statement because I think it's excellent. And I want to be sure that you hear the factual data they provide. From state legislature sessions to city school board meetings, fury attacks on critical race theory continue to ignite heated debates and accusations. According to Berkeley Law and UCLA scholars at a recent webinar event, they addressed the spread of misinformation. Connecting such attacks with a calculated effort to foment racial division, the scholars probe the growing preoccupation with CRT, what mega Republicans call cancel culture, and the work agenda. They also clarify what CRT actually is in this webinar and why it became attacked. Critical race theory was introduced in the 1970s as a legal theory about the relationship between law and racial inequality, said Berkeley Law professor Kira M. Bridges, author of the 2018 book, Critical Race Theory, a primer. The term reaffirming and reinstituting the racial hierarchies that are so obvious in our country today is addressed in this book. But critical race theory, that label is now wielded as a epithet. It's a term of abuse that is being used. Berkeley Law professor Ian Haney Lopez said that while liberal legal theory saw race as interpersonal and law as standing outside of society, critical race theory asserts that racism is also largely legal and economic, and that law is structured by race and has historically predominantly reinforced white dominance. From the very beginning, critical race theorists said we must try to make society better. You never hear that in the opponent's statements. We must try to make society better, explained Lopez. He is the author of the book Dog Whistle Politics, which describes how politicians use veiled racial appeals to persuade white voters to support policies that favor the rich yet threaten their own interests. And he said critical race theory is systematically an interrogation of racism role in our society and a political project to move us toward a more racially egalitarian society. So what they're saying is not true at all. Lopez added that recent attacks on CRT flow from a class war agenda, low taxes on the rich, pro-corporate economic regulation, obscured by a strategy to promote social strife and racial division. The party of the big a big business weaponize critical race theory and cancel culture. Panelists pointed to the strategic timing of CRT being elevated as a hot button issue on Fox News in September of 2020. I'll tell you more about that in another podcast. Shortly before the presidential election, after a tense summer of massive racial protests following the death of George Floyd and other unarmed Black people killed by police. Lopez said the protests threatened the power elite, in particular, seeing the record shattering size of the crowds, how an outrage at racism against Black people drew support from Latinx, Asians, and white Americans, and how large protests occurred in areas with hardly any Black population. That's what the fear was, and that's what's driving the mega Republicans in Trump. That sparked a strong effort to push back against critical race theory, and a successful one, Lopez explained. Anti-Blackness has been exploited as a tool of political division for many, many years. To maintain that tool, the right seeks to recast racial justice protests, like happened, that we've just described, as instead anti-racism. What we have to ask ourselves is the real threat to our families coming from Black people or from the wealthiest people in our country who seek to control the government and other key institutions. The backlash really gained traction, Bridges observed, when critics claimed CRT was being taught to K through 12 schools and framed their opposition to it as protecting their children from racialized threats. Again, if you hear what I've just said about critical race theory, it has nothing to do with their claiming. That explains the passion, fear, and anger we see at these school board meetings, she said. The attacks against critical race theory are a continuation of attacks against perceived threats non-white people pose to our institutions. Threats the Trump campaign, which has sounded for years the following: calling Mexicans crossing the border criminals and rapists, identifying those who walked alongside white supremacists in Charlottesville as very fine people, signing a Muslim travel ban into law, calling COVID the Chinese virus and Kung flu, and so on. UCLA law professor Devin Carballo asked how society accounts for the precariousness of a group once oppressed by slavery and Jim Crow laws that today is marginalized, over incarcerated, underemployed, overrepresented in homelessness, and underrepresented in political leadership and leadership generally. One answer, he says, is that Group A isn't working hard enough. They're talking about Blacks or whatever race they're attacking, not pulling itself up by its bootstraps, Carballo said. Another answer is about the way racism has worked and its continuing legacies. Critical race theory suggests that contemporary Black disadvantages are a function of the way racism has historically operated in our institutions and in our society. What is surprising about racial discourse today is how they reflect the ideas that there's something wrong with Group A, which are African Americans or Asians or whoever they're focusing on, and they try to explain their plight, ignoring white immunity, white privilege, and so forth. If people consider Group A experienced slavery and Jim Crow, they still ended up blaming A for disadvantages that they have experienced and continue to do today. Carballo said, none of the weaponizing of critical race theory is about critical race theory itself. It's about using CRT to engender racial division and undermine multiracial coalition building. Lopez adds, that have you believe the threat isn't coming from those who control so much, but really comes from the people asking for racial inequality. And they're saying racial inequality because they're saying the whites are the ones that are being attacked. Carbato stresses that no significant moment of American racial reform occurred through unified consensus. His UCLA faculty colleague, S.M. Schmidt, said that today's racial ecology and economic crisis can only be surmounted by changing the country's major social systems. Bridges drew an iconic distinction between canceling and what's now known as cancel culture. She said, canceling has been a weapon of the weak, a way that relatively disempowered people exercise autonomy by withdrawing support from someone who has behaved badly. Once the right weaponized this and termed it cancel culture, it became used to describing acts that allegedly threatened the very foundation of our institution and our democracy. In describing how our CRT is depicted in the media and pop culture, panelists said ascribing it to cancer culture is an intentional move to make it seem aggressive, overreaching, and threatening. Lopez cited polls showing that overall support for the Black Lives Matter movement in January 2021 had receded to where it was before 2020 protests, and that white support was 10% lower than in January 2020. As a form of dog whistle politics, this is an attempt to use language that on the surface doesn't mention race, but is designed to trigger racial anxiety. And I think that's what the base is. People who support Trump and who are mega Republicans. That theme, gangbangers, anarchists, terrorists, knife-wielding illegals flooding across the border, is being revived in attacks on CRT. And these are things that have been, have been said for years. The message is that people who demand racial justice are motivated by hatred of white people, while demands for equality are portrayed as instead efforts to invert the hierarchy. And I think it's fascinating to see, and I want to read that again, because I think this is the key to what mega Republicans of Trump do. The message is that people who demand racial justice, which I'm supporting, and I'm a white person, are motivated by hatred of white people. I don't hate white people. I have many friends that are white people from other races. While demands for equality are portrayed as instead efforts to invert the hierarchy. Bridges ends this article by saying, if structural racism is a thing, if anti-Blackness manifests in multiple ways, then those Black Lives Matter protests were about something real and something we can transform. But if structural racism is a myth, like Trump and the mega Republicans are claiming, offered by scholars, you hate white people. Those people in the streets were the madmen and the racists, and the most appropriate response is to ignore them. Now, in the next podcast, I'm going to provide more detail about critical race theory. I will give more from the original writers about CRT. I'm going to give you another summary that I think is the best of all the articles I've read that tells what critical race theory is and why some states are banning it. After you receive the materials from podcast 50, then you will have a better chance of beginning to formulate what your answer would be to Bridges' last statement in this podcast. If structural racism is a thing, if anti-Blackness manifests in multiple ways, then those Black Lives Matter protests were about something real, something we can transform. But if structural racism is a myth offered by scholars who hate white people, those people in the streets were the madmen, and they're racist, and the most appropriate response is to ignore them. And I think it'll be very hard for you to support the latter statement. The first one, I think, is much more real. Thank you.